The night air over the valley trembled with the stuttering roar of machine guns and the sharp cracking echoes of rifles. Smoke clung low to the ground, drifting across shattered mud walls and splintered palm trees, glowing faintly under the orange arc of tracer fire. The SEALs were dug in along the ruins of an abandoned compound, crouched behind chunks of stone and rusting metal sheets as waves of enemy fighters poured out of the hills. Dust burst into the air each time a round chewed into the ground around them, and every few seconds the sky lit up with the flash of an RPG streaking across the valley. 2 more coming in from the ridge. Chief Petty Officer Maddox shouted, his voice hoarse from hours of yelling over the gunfire. He leaned out, firing a burst from his M4, cutting one figure down in mid-run while the other dove behind a rock. Sweat streaked the dirt on his face, and his arms trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. They had been pinned here for nearly 3 hours, and the valley seemed endless with enemies. Lieutenant Carter ducked as a round snapped past his helmet. He pressed his radio hard against his ear, straining to hear over the chaos. "Command, this is Viper Actual. We are taking heavy contact at Grid Delta 75. Request immediate close air support. We're running low on ammo." His words came rapid, precise, but even as he said them his stomach sank. He had been calling for support for over 15 minutes, and each time the reply was the same: stand by. He glanced across the compound where 4 of his men fired from staggered positions. Alvarez was down on one knee, feeding a fresh belt into the saw, his jaw clenched, firing short bursts into the treeline. Hall was bleeding from his arm but refused to stop shooting, propping his rifle against the wall as he reloaded with one hand. They were holding but only just. Finally the radio crackled back. "Viper Actual, be advised. Air support is gone. Repeat, air support is unavailable. All birds diverted to priority strikes. You are on your own." For a second Carter thought he'd misheard. Then the weight of it hit him like a punch to the chest. He locked eyes with Maddox, who had just slammed a fresh mag into his weapon. Maddox gave a grim half-smile, that dark humor of men who knew the odds. "Well, sir, guess we hold the line with what we've got." Carter exhaled slowly. There was no time to argue. He slammed the radio back on his vest and shouted down the line, "We're on our own. Conserve your ammo. Make every shot count." The fighters surged again, charging down the slope with wild shouts. Bullets hammered into the compound walls. An RPG streaked overhead and detonated in a blinding flash behind them, showering dirt and debris across the courtyard. Alvarez was thrown to the ground, coughing, but he dragged himself up and returned to his gun. Hall gritted his teeth and fired into the smoke. Maddox ducked low beside Carter, swapping mags with quick, practiced movements. "We're not making it out of here if this keeps up. They'll push straight through us." Carter's jaw tightened. He knew Maddox was right, but saying it out loud gave it weight and he couldn't afford despair. He peered out toward the ridge, scanning the dark horizon. All he saw were muzzle flashes in the distance, endless streams of shadows darting forward. Then something strange cut through the noise, a low rumble, faint at first, almost mistaken for thunder. Carter frowned, leaning his head, straining to hear. It grew louder, deeper, a rolling growl that seemed to shake the earth. The men noticed too. Alvarez paused in reloading, his ears perking despite the gunfire. Maddox's eyes narrowed, and a small grin flickered across his tired face. "Tell me that's what I think it is," Maddox muttered. The rumble built into a scream, raw, metallic, tearing through the sky like a beast unleashed. Carter's heart jumped. He knew that sound. Every soldier who had ever fought in the dust and fire knew it. The unmistakable howl of twin turbofans, the war cry of a machine designed for one purpose: close, merciless destruction. And then it appeared. Out of the darkness, low against the valley floor, a silhouette burst through the smoke, wings spread wide like a predator descending from the night. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, its blunt nose bristling with the massive Gu-8 Avenger cannon, engines screaming with fury. The enemy fighters scattered in panic as the aircraft roared overhead, and then came the sound, the bone-shaking, teeth-rattling BRRT that ripped the night apart. A line of fire tore through the hillside, stitching explosions across the ridge as dirt, rock, and men were shredded into chaos. The ground trembled beneath the sheer violence of the gun run. The SEALs froze for half a second in awe, then erupted into cheers even as they kept firing. Alvarez slammed his hand against the wall, laughing in disbelief. Holy hell, she's back. Carter couldn't help the surge of relief that washed through him. His chest felt lighter, his legs stronger, as the Warthog banked and came around for another pass. "Keep your heads down," he shouted, though his voice carried more hope now than command. The A-10 swooped low again, unleashing another devastating burst. The hillside erupted, enemy positions obliterated in flashes of fire. Fighters scrambled, their assault broken, their momentum shattered under the storm of gunfire. The SEALs used the opening, pouring their remaining rounds into the fleeing figures, cutting them down as the Warthog carved the battlefield into ruin. Maddox leaned against the wall, catching his breath, his grin wide despite the dirt and blood on his face. "You hear that, Lieutenant? That's the sound of the angel we needed." Carter nodded, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't know where the A-10 had come from, why it had returned when command had said support was gone. But right now it didn't matter. All that mattered was that the fight wasn't over, and as long as that machine screamed above them, they had a chance to live. The valley smelled of gunpowder and burned metal, the air thick with the acrid stench of death and dust. The A-10's second pass had carved a scar across the hillside, leaving flames licking up from shattered vehicles and broken bodies. For a fleeting moment, the battlefield fell into silence except for the ringing in their ears and the rasp of their own breathing. The SEALs exchanged quick glances, adrenaline still surging through them. Relief was sharp but fleeting because in war, silence never lasted. Carter pressed his radio again, voice cutting through the static. "Command, this is Viper Actual. Confirm air support, we've got a hog on station." "Who sent it?" His words were rapid, edged with disbelief. The reply came slow, uncertain. "Negative, Viper. All aircraft were diverted. We don't have anything on your grid." Carter froze, eyes narrowing. He looked up at the black silhouette circling overhead, its engines growling as it banked wide to prepare another run. Whoever was in that cockpit wasn't supposed to be here, and yet they were. An angel or a ghost, it didn't matter. All that mattered was survival. "Doesn't matter what command says," Maddox muttered beside him, watching the hog cut its arc through the night. "She's ours now. Let's use her." The enemy wasn't finished. Shadows still crawled along the ridge lines, regrouping in the treeline. The flash of movement betrayed them even as they tried to hide. A truck engine roared to life, headlights flicking on before quickly killing to avoid being targeted, but the noise carried across the valley. The fighters were rallying, desperate, unwilling to abandon the fight. "Alvarez, Hall, cover left flank. Maddox, with me on the right." Carter barked, slipping fresh mags into his vest with shaking hands. He could feel the fatigue biting into his limbs, but the renewed hope burning inside him kept his voice firm. Above, the A-10 rolled in again, and the night split apart with another unholy scream of cannon fire. The rounds chewed through the treeline, ripping apart branches, splinters spraying like shrapnel. Men ran, stumbled, fell. The sound alone, like the tearing of the sky, was enough to break morale. Yet in the chaos, a plume of smoke streaked up from the hillside, an enemy manpad, a shoulder-fired missile twisting toward the hog. Carter's heart lurched. The missile screamed upward, tracing a fiery line toward the circling aircraft. For a breathless second it looked like the end. But the pilot reacted with impossible precision. The hog flared, banking hard, releasing flares that bloomed like burning stars. The missile curved, chasing before veering off and detonating harmlessly in the night sky. The men below shouted in frustration, but the hog's engines roared back in defiance. She was still in the fight. "Damn, that's one hell of a pilot," Maddox muttered, awe mixing with grim satisfaction. The SEALs kept firing, pushing back against the enemy's renewed assault. Carter could see their ammo dwindling, mags tossed aside, belts shortened, but each man fought like the next trigger squeeze was the only thing keeping death at bay. The A-10 bought them moments, bought them openings, but it couldn't fight everywhere at once. Another RPG slammed into the compound wall, blowing chunks of stone across Carter's position. He hit the ground, coughing, his ears ringing again. Hall staggered but dragged himself back upright, blood soaking deeper into his sleeve. "I'm good," he shouted through clenched teeth though his face was pale. Carter's mind raced. They couldn't stay pinned forever. The hog could suppress, but they had to move, had to break contact or they'd be overrun the moment the bird left or ran out of ammo. He slammed the radio again. "Pilot, this is Viper Actual. If you can hear me, we need a corridor cleared, southwest ridge, 200 meters. We're pushing through." He didn't know if the pilot was tuned in, if the transmission would even reach. He was shouting into the void, hoping the ghost above was listening. For a long breath there was nothing, just the rumble of engines above. Then, crackling faintly through his earpiece, a voice came, calm, cool, tinged with that mix of grit and steel only combat pilots carried. "Copy, Viper Actual. Corridor southwest ridge. Stand by." Carter's chest tightened with relief. The Hog had heard. The aircraft dropped low, impossibly low, engines screaming as it unleashed hell upon the southwest ridge. Explosions ripped across the hillside, trees splintering, rocks shattering, men scattering in all directions. The earth itself seemed to heave under the weight of destruction. When the dust cleared, a jagged corridor lay open, a path cut through the chaos. "That's our window," Carter roared. "Move. Move now." The SEALs surged from cover, sprinting through the broken courtyard, ducking low as rounds cracked past them. Maddox fired bursts to cover Alvarez as he staggered forward with the saw. Hall limped but kept pace, teeth clenched against the pain. Carter brought up the rear, firing in controlled bursts, forcing the enemy back. Above, the Hog circled like a guardian, shredding any cluster of fighters that dared to block their escape. Each pass sent the ground erupting in fire and dirt, each burst buying the SEALs more precious ground. They reached the base of the ridge, lungs burning, legs screaming, but adrenaline kept them moving. The smell of cordite and burned earth filled their nostrils as they scrambled up the slope. Behind them, the compound they'd held for hours was nothing but smoke and rubble, the battlefield a twisted scar under the moonlight. At the crest, Carter dropped to one knee, scanning back over the valley. Fighters still moved, regrouping in pockets, their shouts carried faint on the wind. But their assault had been broken, their momentum shattered. And above, the Hog's silhouette cut another arc through the night sky, engines rumbling like thunder. Maddox collapsed beside him, chest heaving, sweat streaking down his face. "We're alive," he muttered, half in disbelief, half in gratitude. "We should be dead 10 times over, but we're still breathing." Carter nodded, wiping grime from his face, eyes fixed on the aircraft circling above. Whoever that pilot was, they had given them more than fire support. They had given them a chance. And in war, sometimes a chance was everything. The ridge gave them cover, but only barely. The slope dipped into a winding gully that cut south through the valley, its walls jagged and steep, littered with boulders and dry brush. The SEALs stumbled into it, panting, clutching their rifles, the adrenaline wearing thin as exhaustion clawed at their bodies. Every muscle screamed, every breath felt like fire, but they pushed forward, driven by instinct and survival. Behind them, the battlefield still echoed with the distant thump of gunfire. The enemy hadn't given up. Faint flashes popped along the ridge and angry voices carried on the wind. The fighters were regrouping, reorganizing, and soon they'd be on the hunt again. Carter led the column, rifle tight against his shoulder, eyes scanning every shadow. Maddox stayed close on his flank, ever the steady anchor of the team, his breathing heavy but controlled. Alvarez trudged in the middle, the saw weighing him down, yet he carried it without complaint, jaw clenched with determination. Hall lagged slightly, blood dripping down his arm, his face pale, but when Carter glanced back, Hall gave a small nod, forcing a smirk that said, "Don't worry about me." Above, the A-10 remained, circling like a predator guarding its wounded pack. The rumble of its engines rolled across the valley, a constant reminder they weren't alone. Occasionally, the pilot dipped low, sending short bursts into clusters of fighters attempting to shadow the SEALs' retreat. Each time, the bursts scattered the enemy like frightened animals, buying the team a little more ground. Still, Carter knew the Hog couldn't stay forever. Pilots had fuel limits, ammo counts, orders. And whoever this pilot was, they were already off the books. "We need an exfil plan," Carter muttered under his breath. Maddox glanced at him, reading the strain in his expression but saying nothing. They pressed deeper into the gully until the valley opened slightly, revealing a cracked dirt road leading southwest. A burned-out vehicle smoldered nearby, riddled with bullet holes, its tires melted into the ground. Carter raised a fist, signaling a halt. The men crouched low, catching their breath, weapons still trained outward. Alvarez broke the silence first, voice rough but tinged with disbelief. "Sir, who the hell is flying that thing?" Command swore up and down, "We had no air." Carter shook his head. "Doesn't matter right now. We move while we've got cover. If that pilot wants to ghost us, let him. We'll thank him later." Hall chuckled weakly, adjusting the makeshift bandage on his arm. "If we live long enough to do it." Carter was about to respond when the radio crackled. It wasn't command. It was the same calm, steel-edged voice from before. "Viper Actual, this is Hog 1. I got eyes on your movement. Be advised, enemy forces are consolidating North Ridge 2 clicks out. You'll have contact in under 10 minutes if you don't keep moving. Recommend you push southwest to grid Sierra 2-4. Terrain's rough, but I can keep their heads down." Carter exchanged a look with Maddox. The voice wasn't just calm, it carried the kind of experience you couldn't fake. Whoever this pilot was, they weren't just good. They were exceptional. "Copy Hog 1, Carter replied, his tone clipped but respectful. "We're moving to Sierra 2-4. Keep us covered if you can." "Roger that. Stay low and keep your heads down. I'll clear the path." The transmission cut, and almost instantly the Hog swooped low over the ridgeline ahead. Its cannon tore into the rocks, blasting apart hidden positions before they could become ambush points. The SEALs flinched at the sheer violence of the run, but Carter's chest tightened with relief. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were being guided. The team pushed forward along the road, boots crunching against gravel, sweat dripping into their eyes. Every few minutes, the Hog would scream overhead, delivering bursts of fire that shattered enemy pursuit. The pilot never wasted rounds. Every pass was precise, devastating, and perfectly timed. Still, the enemy was relentless. Gunfire began crackling from the north ridge, tracer rounds slicing into the gully. The fighters were pushing harder now, furious at the defiance of their prey. One round clipped a rock inches from Alvarez's head, showering him with chips of stone. He cursed, dropping low as Maddox fired back, his shots quick and measured. "Contact left ridge," Maddox shouted. The team ducked behind boulders, returning fire in controlled bursts. Carter's rifle barked, each shot finding a shadow or muzzle flash. Hall gritted his teeth, firing with his uninjured arm, each squeeze of the trigger a defiance of pain. Alvarez's saw thundered, cutting swaths through the treeline. The enemy fire began to build, pressing them harder. Then, as if answering a prayer, the Hog screamed in from the east. The cannon spat death across the ridge, shredding enemy positions with brutal efficiency. The survivors scattered again, their momentum broken. The men exhaled, the weight easing from their shoulders for just a moment. Maddox slapped the side of his helmet, grinning. "I'm starting to think that pilot's got a sixth sense." But Carter wasn't smiling. He looked up at the circling silhouette, questions swirling in his mind. Who had sent this bird? Why here, why now? Pilots didn't just go rogue, not in this kind of theater. And yet here was this Hog, flying like a ghost from another war, shielding them when no one else would. The team pressed on, weaving through the broken terrain, following the coordinates Hog 1 had given. The night deepened, stars faint against the haze of smoke, the moon casting a pale glow across the battered land. Finally, they reached a narrow defile in the ridge, the entrance to a rocky canyon that stretched southwest. Carter signaled the men to hold as he scanned the path ahead. It was rough terrain, jagged and uneven, but it offered cover, and maybe, just maybe, a way out. "Hog 1, this is Viper Actual," Carter radioed, voice steady. "We're at Sierra 2-4. Moving into canyon. Can you keep overwatch?" The reply came quick. "Roger, Viper. I got your 6. Stay sharp. Intel says hostiles are pulling reinforcements from the east. I'll keep them off you as long as I've got ammo. After that, you're on your own." The words hung heavy in the air. As long as I've got ammo. Carter felt the weight of them sink in. The Hog wasn't endless. Even angels bled out eventually. "Copy," Carter said, forcing his voice firm. "We'll make it count." The team slipped into the canyon, shadows swallowing them as the Hog roared above. Behind them, the valley still burned, the echoes of destruction rolling like distant thunder. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the relentless pursuit of an enemy that refused to quit. But for the first time since the night began, Carter felt something more than survival clawing in his chest. He felt resolve. Because someone up there believed they were worth saving. And Carter intended to live long enough to find out why. The canyon swallowed them in darkness, the jagged cliffs towering above like the walls of a tomb. Every sound carried, boots crunching over loose rock, the clatter of gear, the echo of shallow breaths. The team moved in staggered formation, weapons up, nerves coiled tight. The walls offered cover from distant ridges, but they also trapped them. If the enemy pushed in force, this canyon would become a kill box. Carter knew it too. His eyes scanned the high ledges, every shadow a potential firing point. He felt the pressure of time like a blade against his neck. The Hog overhead rumbled occasionally, a reminder that their ghost guardian still circled. But its passes had grown less frequent, the bursts shorter, as though the pilot was rationing what little ammunition remained. Maddox jogged up beside him, voice low but urgent. "Lieutenant, we're burning daylight we don't have. Hall's bleeding out, Alvarez is on fumes, and we've still got half the valley to cross before we even sniff extraction. If the bird runs dry, it's just us again." Carter nodded grimly, eyes flicking back to Hall. The corpsman had patched his wound as best he could, but the bandage was soaked through. Hall still kept moving, jaw tight, refusing to complain, but each step dragged a little slower. Alvarez, weighed down with the saw, looked equally worn, his face pale, his ammo belts nearly empty. They were fighting on the edge. The radio crackled suddenly, the pilot's voice calm but edged with urgency. Viper Actual Hog 1. Be advised, you've got a company-size element pushing from East Canyon mouth. They'll cut you off in less than 5. Recommend immediate movement or you'll be boxed in. Carter cursed under his breath. Copy Hog 1. What's your ordnance? There was a pause, then the reply. 2 passes left with the Avenger, maybe 1 strafe with rockets. After that, I'm Winchester. No fuel to RTB yet, but I'll stick with you until I flame out if I have to. The words hit hard. Whoever was up there wasn't just disobeying orders, they were risking their life and their bird for a handful of seals on the ground. Carter clenched his jaw, forcing the surge of gratitude back down where it couldn't distract him. Understood. Make those passes count. Always do, the pilot replied, and then the transmission cut. The first shots came seconds later. Muzzle flashes bloomed along the canyon's lip, tracers hissing downward like red-hot rain. The SEALs dove for cover, bullets sparking off rocks, the air filled with the shriek of ricochets. Hall collapsed behind a boulder, clutching his rifle tight, breathing hard. Alvarez dropped prone, bracing the saw against the dirt, laying down bursts that raked the canyon rim. Maddox fired quick, sharp shots, forcing the enemy back from their perches. Then the hog screamed in. The roar grew deafening, echoing between the canyon walls as the A-10 descended almost impossibly low. Its nose dipped and the Avenger cannon unleashed hell. The sound, rolled through the canyon like a thunderclap, drowning out everything else. The ledges above disintegrated, rock and men alike torn apart in a shower of fire and dust. Shouts turned to screams, then to silence. Move! Carter bellowed, seizing the moment. Push through before they regroup. The SEALs scrambled up, sprinting through the haze. Their boots slipped on loose gravel, lungs burning, but they pressed forward, driven by the hog's thunder still ringing in their ears. Alvarez's saw barked in short bursts to suppress stragglers. Maddox stayed rear guard, cool under pressure, firing in controlled rhythm. But the canyon narrowed again, funneling them into a choke point. Ahead, more enemy fighters appeared, scrambling down from hidden trails, rifles spitting fire. The SEALs dove for what little cover there was. Carter's rifle bucked against his shoulder, dropping 2, then 3, but there were more. Always more. Hog 1 were cut off. Carter shouted into the radio, desperation creeping in despite himself. Copy Viper. Last pass. Mark your positions. Carter popped a flare, the bright red glow hissing upward into the night. A heartbeat later, the hog swept in again, its engines howling with fury. Rockets streaked from its wings, slamming into the canyon ahead. The blast shook the ground, a wave of heat washing over the SEALs as fire and rock consumed the enemy position. The survivors broke, scattering back into the shadows, their screams swallowed by the echoing canyon walls. The hog pulled up, banking hard, its silhouette cutting sharp against the moon. For a moment, the SEALs stood frozen, awe and relief washing over them. Then Carter's radio crackled once more. That's it, Viper. I'm dry. I'll keep eyes on, but I've got nothing left to throw. Carter swallowed hard, the reality sinking in. Their angel had emptied its claws. From here on, it was just the men on the ground. Copy Hog 1, Carter said quietly. You've done more than enough. We'll finish it. The team pressed deeper into the canyon, weapons up, every sense straining. Without the hog's thunder, the silence felt heavier, almost suffocating. They could hear the enemy regrouping in the distance, the faint crackle of radios, shouted orders echoing off the stone. Hall stumbled, dropping to one knee, his rifle clattering against the rocks. Maddox was at his side instantly, hauling him up with one arm, steadying him. Hall's face was ghostly pale now, his breathing shallow. I'm slowing you down, he muttered, voice weak. Shut it, Maddox growled. You're still in this fight. Carter glanced back, torn between urgency and loyalty. Leaving a man behind wasn't an option. But every second they lingered gave the enemy time to box them in again. His mind raced, weighing routes, risks, possibilities. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the voice again through the radio. Viper Actual Hog 1. I can't give you firepower anymore, but I've got eyes. You've got a fork in the canyon ahead. Left is blocked, right will get you through, but you'll need to move fast. I'll guide you from above. Carter exhaled, tension loosening just enough. Even without guns, the hog was still with them. Their angel wasn't leaving yet. Copy Hog 1, Carter said, signaling the men forward. We're moving right. Keep talking us through. The team surged ahead, every step heavy but fueled by the knowledge that someone still watched their backs. Above, the engines rumbled faintly, a reminder in the night. The SEALs pushed into the canyon fork, shadows closing around them, the danger far from over. But in their hearts, the fight had shifted. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were men carrying the will of the unseen pilot who refused to let them die. The world seemed to slow in the moments after the A-10's last pass. Smoke hung heavy over the valley like a dark veil, broken only by sudden bursts of flame where munitions had detonated fuel or ammo stashes hidden by the insurgents. The canyon echoed with the thunder of collapsing rock and burning metal, but within that chaos, a strange silence clung to the SEALs' senses. Their bodies were still in motion, crouching, reloading, scanning, but their minds were catching up to the impossible. They were still alive. Grant pushed himself against the jagged rock wall, chest heaving, his rifle resting loosely across his lap. His ears rang from the blasts, but through that haze, he could hear it, the fading growl of the A-10's engines as it circled wider, preparing another pass. The sound was not just mechanical, it was a lifeline, proof that they weren't completely abandoned. Status check. Grant barked, his voice hoarse. Minor burns, nothing serious. Torres called back, already patting down his gear, ensuring nothing had been punctured. Got shrapnel in the vest, but it didn't get through. Maddox replied, holding up a cracked ceramic plate from his body armor with a shaky grin. The others gave their quick affirmatives. No one was dead. No one had been left broken in the dust. Against the odds, they were still a fighting team. The radio hissed again, finally clear enough to make out. Reaper flight on station. Winchester on cannon in 3 mics. Reload cycle engaged. Say again, 3 mics out for another run. Hold your ground. Grant's heart thudded. 3 minutes could be an eternity if the enemy regrouped. Copy, Reaper. We'll hold. Make it count when you come back. Across the canyon floor, through smoke and the rolling clouds of dust, he could see shapes moving. Insurgents, those who hadn't been torn apart by the A-10's pass, were reorganizing. A few stood and fired sporadic bursts toward the SEALs' positions. Others dragged wounded comrades behind cover, shouting orders in harsh tones. It wasn't over. The Warthog had gutted their charge but not broken their will. Grant clenched his jaw. They're not done yet. Neither are we. All right, boys, he said, lowering his voice but filling it with steel. You heard the man. 3 minutes. That's all we need to survive. Set your fields of fire, watch for movement. They'll try to rush us before the bird comes back. Yes, sir, the team echoed, instinctively falling into their practiced rhythm. They shifted positions, braced their rifles on rocks, and checked magazines. The air reeked of cordite, blood, and burning fuel, but in that infernal scent, there was clarity. They knew their roles. The first wave came quickly. A cluster of insurgents emerged from the haze on the left flank, shouting war cries as they sprinted up the rocky incline with rifles blazing. Tracers whipped through the air, striking sparks from stone. Maddox and Torres opened fire immediately, their controlled bursts cutting down the front runners. One man tumbled backward into his comrades, creating a pileup that bought precious seconds. Grant squeezed off rounds with clinical precision. Every pull of the trigger was deliberate. Every target acquired, every shot placed. There was no room for wasted ammunition. His rifle cracked and another insurgent fell. They're flanking right. Hawkins yelled, pivoting his weapon to cover the opposite slope. Sure enough, figures were scrambling up a narrow goat path, trying to get above them. Hawkins' machine gun barked, the heavy rattle echoing like a second heartbeat in the canyon. Dust plumes exploded around the climbing insurgents as rounds ripped into them, forcing survivors to dive for cover. The SEALs were holding, but pressure was mounting. More muzzle flashes erupted from the canyon's edge, enemy marksmen laying down covering fire. Bullets zipped dangerously close, ricocheting off their rocky cover. One slug chipped stone inches from Grant's cheek, stinging his skin with fragments. We've got snipers in the treeline. Torres shouted. Grant adjusted instantly. Suppressing fire. Don't let them settle. He popped smoke grenades, tossing them into the open to obscure the SEALs' silhouettes. White plumes billowed outward, cloaking their positions. Through the haze, Grant switched to short bursts, firing into the treeline to keep the enemy heads down. Seconds crawled. Each felt like a battle in itself. The insurgents were relentless, fueled by fury and desperation. But the SEALs fought with precision, each man anchoring the others. They weren't giving ground. Not now, not with survival so close. Then, like salvation, the A-10's growl returned. It wasn't distant anymore. It roared over the canyon, engines screaming as the bird banked low, preparing its run. The sound was deafening, primal, a predator returning to finish the kill. Grant's voice cut through the chaos. Mark targets. Paint 'em for Reaper. Hawkins tossed a smoke marker, its bright color igniting in the haze, clearly designating the enemy's densest position. The insurgents saw it too, panic spread among their ranks. They knew what was coming. The Warthog dove. The earth shook as 30mm shells chewed through the canyon floor. Explosions ripped lines across the insurgent stronghold, shredding cover and bodies alike. The sound of the Gu-8 was no longer terrifying to the SEALs, it was triumphant, their war song, tearing apart everything that had threatened to consume them. Dust and flames swallowed the valley. When the A-10 pulled up, banking wide again, the canyon was unrecognizable. Craters smoked, shattered weapons littered the ground, and what remained of the insurgent force was broken, scattered figures fleeing into the mountains, no longer an organized threat. The battlefield belonged to the SEALs once more. The team exhaled as one. Relief came in shudders, in laughter that was half mad, in tears no one would admit to. Torres slumped against his pack muttering, "Holy hell, we're still here." Grant didn't allow himself to relax fully. Not yet. Eyes open. Sweep the field. Make sure no stragglers try anything stupid. But even he felt it, the weight lifting, the impossible odds shifting. The radio cracked again. Reaper flight, final pass complete. Fuel state critical. RTB. You boys still breathing down there? Grant grabbed the handset, his voice steady though his body trembled. We're breathing. Thanks to you. There was a chuckle on the other end, rough and tired. Don't thank me yet. You still got to get home. Good hunting, Reaper out. The line went dead, but it didn't matter. The A-10 had given them what they needed: time, survival, a chance. The rest was up to them. Grant looked at his men, mud-streaked, bloodied, exhausted, but alive. All right, brothers. We're not done. We regroup, we move, and we get the hell out of this canyon. The fight's not over, but damned if we didn't win this round. Their voices rose in agreement, low and fierce. They were SEALs. They had stared into the abyss and clawed their way back. And as long as they had each other, and the roar of a warthog in their memories, they were unstoppable. The long, grinding war of attrition had reached a breaking point. 4 months, the Allied pilots had endured the cat-and-mouse struggle in the Pacific skies, with the formidable Japanese Zero still ruling many battlefields. But now, after countless sorties, experiments, and losses, the F-4U Corsair was beginning to show its full potential. The fighter once mocked for its size, dismissed as too much airplane for the pilot, was slowly but surely proving itself to be a predator unlike anything the enemy had ever faced. Jack and his fellow aviators were at the heart of this turning tide. The squadron's missions had grown deadlier, their targets more ambitious, and their confidence sharper with every encounter. By now they knew the Corsair's quirks as well as their own heartbeat. The long nose that blocked vision during landing, the sheer torque that could flip a careless rookie, and the brutal force it unleashed when the throttle was pushed to its limit. What had once been a challenge was now a weapon, and the pilots had adapted themselves around the machine's strengths. The latest mission briefing brought with it a sense of inevitability. Intelligence had confirmed the location of a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold on a remote island chain. Enemy airfields, supply depots, and a command post all clustered together, a target too important to ignore. If destroyed, it would sever a major artery of Japanese logistics and weaken their grip on the surrounding seas. But it also meant going head-to-head with some of the most elite Zero squadrons still left in the theater. Jack sat at the long wooden table with the other pilots, studying the maps and photographs spread across its surface. His CO's voice carried through the tent like a steady drumbeat. We'll be flying in low and fast, hitting the supply depots first. Expect heavy anti-aircraft fire. Zeros will scramble the moment they spot us, so stay tight, stay disciplined. This is not a free hunt, it's coordinated strikes. Corsairs will escort the bombers in, then peel off to engage enemy fighters. There was a silence that followed, heavy with anticipation. The men knew this wasn't just another sortie. This was a statement, a chance to prove that the tide had truly shifted. That night, Jack found himself unable to sleep. He stared at the ceiling of his canvas tent, listening to the hum of insects outside and the distant crash of waves on the reef. He thought about the early days when the Corsair had been ridiculed, when his own squadron had doubted its worth. He remembered friends lost in the learning curve, good men who had paid the price for every lesson written into the aircraft's history. Tomorrow, he promised himself, would be for them. At dawn, the airfield roared to life. The corsairs sat lined up like predatory birds, their dark blue paint glinting under the rising sun. Jack strapped in, feeling the vibrations of the engine surge through the frame as the massive propeller spun into motion. The smell of fuel, the heat of the Pacific morning, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins all fused into a single sharp focus. Falcon Squadron, you are cleared for takeoff. The corsairs thundered down the strip one by one, lifting into the golden sky with a grace that belied their bulk. Jack pulled back on the stick, the horizon tilting as his machine climbed effortlessly into the clouds. He could feel the raw power waiting under his control, and for the first time, he understood why the Japanese had come to fear the sight of the bent-wing bird. The formation cut through the morning air, silent but for the low growl of engines. Soon the island target loomed ahead, black smoke already rising as Allied bombers had begun their runs. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, flak exploding in black blossoms around them. Jack swerved, feeling the thud of shockwaves rattling his cockpit. His heart raced, but his focus narrowed to a single point: survival and execution. Zeros inbound, 10 o'clock high. The radio crackled, and within moments the sky was alive with motion. Sleek, agile Japanese fighters dove toward them, their silver wings catching the sunlight. Jack yanked his Corsair into a climbing turn, the G-forces pressing him into his seat. A Zero latched onto his tail, its gun spitting fire. But Jack had trained for this. He pushed the throttle, the Corsair's engine howling as he pulled into a steep climb. The Zero followed, but its engine strained, faltering wear. The Corsair's sheer horsepower carried it higher. At the apex, Jack rolled hard, cutting across the Zero's path, and unleashed a burst of .50 caliber fire. The enemy plane erupted in flame, spiraling into the sea below. "Splash 1, he shouted into the radio, his voice raw with exhilaration. Around him, the battle unfolded in a chaotic ballet. Corsairs tangled with Zeros, each maneuver a deadly gamble of speed, skill, and instinct. The bombers pressed on, unloading their payloads onto fuel depots and runways, while plumes of fire rose from the ground. Jack locked onto another Zero diving toward the bombers. He rolled inverted, dove behind it, and fired in short, disciplined bursts. The rounds tore through the fuselage, shredding its tail. The enemy pilot bailed too late. The plane disintegrated in midair. Minutes felt like hours. Jack's arms ached from the constant strain of the stick, sweat soaked his flight suit, and his ammo counter ticked dangerously low. But he refused to relent. Each Corsair seemed to be everywhere at once, overwhelming the enemy with speed, firepower, and ruthless precision. Finally, the radio crackled again. "Falcons, bombers are clear. Targets destroyed. Time to head home." Jack looked down at the island below, its once orderly airfield now a smoking ruin, enemy planes burning on the tarmac, supplies scattered in flames. Above, the sky was theirs. What had begun as a desperate gamble had ended in decisive victory. The Corsairs regrouped, battered but intact, and turned back toward the horizon. Jack allowed himself a long, shaky breath, the kind that carried both exhaustion and triumph. The bent-wing bird, mocked and doubted, had shown its teeth. Back at base, the squadron gathered in the mess hall, their faces streaked with grime but lit with weary smiles. The laughter came easy now, born from the shared knowledge that they had done more than survive. They had made history. Jack sat quietly for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. He thought of the friends who hadn't lived to see this day, of the sacrifices etched into every rivet of the Corsair. But he also felt pride, deep and unshakable, in what they had accomplished. The fighter that had once been underestimated was now feared. The underdog had become the hunter. And Jack knew, as he lifted his cup in a silent toast, that the war's skies would never be the same again. The months that followed were a whirlwind of transformation, not only for Aisha but for the entire unit that had once dismissed her. The competition had come and gone, her victory still echoing through the barracks like an anthem of resilience. Yet victory, as she soon realized, was not the end of the journey, it was only the beginning. Her commanders, once skeptical, began assigning her to more advanced drills and frontline simulations. These exercises were grueling, designed to test both mental and physical thresholds. Hours under the scorching sun, long marches across unforgiving terrain, and relentless combat scenarios with barely a moment's pause. But instead of faltering, Aisha thrived. Each drop of sweat was proof of her commitment. Each aching muscle was a reminder of her growth. Her fellow soldiers noticed too. The same recruits who once mocked her slight build now studied her form, her timing, her way of conserving energy for decisive strikes. They began seeking her advice, asking how she maintained such sharp focus even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm. It was not just skill that inspired them, but the quiet resilience that radiated from her presence. She never lorded her victories over them. She carried her strength humbly, like a torch meant to guide rather than blind. But success also brought new challenges. In the mess hall, whispers spread of higher-ranking officers keeping a close watch on her progress. Some praised her determination, saying she might be destined for leadership. Others were less kind, insisting her victories had been flukes, strokes of luck that would eventually run dry. Aisha did not let such talk sway her. She knew that respect, once earned, could be lost in an instant if she allowed doubt to creep in. One evening, after an especially brutal endurance march, she found herself sitting alone near the training grounds. The stars stretched across the sky, a canvas of quiet light above the harsh military landscape. She leaned back against her pack, closing her eyes, allowing herself a rare moment of stillness. That was when Farid, one of the recruits who had once mocked her most viciously, approached. "You made us all eat our words," he admitted, his voice stripped of arrogance. "I never thought I'd say this, but you earned my respect." Aisha opened her eyes, studying him. His tone carried no sarcasm, only honesty. "It's not about making anyone eat their words," she replied softly. "It's about proving to myself that I belong here. The rest is just noise." Farid nodded, sitting beside her. From that night onward, the animosity between them dissolved. Slowly, he became one of her staunchest allies, even defending her when others attempted to undermine her achievements. The true test, however, came when the unit was deployed for a large-scale joint exercise with other battalions. It was the kind of event where reputations were forged or broken. Each squad was assigned to capture and hold strategic points in a simulated battlefield that stretched across miles of rugged terrain. Commanders observed every move, noting leadership, adaptability, and cohesion. Aisha's squad entered the exercise with a mixture of excitement and unease. While her growth had been undeniable, many wondered if she could perform under such high-pressure conditions against seasoned opponents. The scenario began at dawn, with fog rolling across the hills like a curtain veiling the stage of war. Orders were barked, boots thudded across uneven ground, and the sound of simulated gunfire echoed through the valleys. From the very first hour, Aisha proved indispensable. She anticipated ambushes before they occurred, guiding her squad through alternate routes that minimized casualties. She organized rotations to keep her teammates sharp, ensuring no one burned out too quickly. And when enemy squads cornered them near a ravine, it was Aisha who devised the daring maneuver that turned the tide. Using smoke grenades to obscure visibility, she led a flanking charge that routed their opponents and secured the ridge they were tasked to defend. By dusk, the results were clear. Her squad had outperformed every other unit in their sector. Commanders praised their coordination, efficiency, and resilience. But when pressed to identify the reason for their success, her squad mates spoke with one voice: it was Aisha. The recognition was both exhilarating and overwhelming. For the first time, her name appeared on official reports as a recommended candidate for specialized training. She was summoned to the commander's tent, where the battalion leader, a stern veteran with decades of service, regarded her with a calculating gaze. "You've surprised many," he said, his tone measured. "Some believed you would not last. Others claimed you were an exception, not a soldier. Yet here you are, proving them wrong again and again. Tell me, Private Aisha, what drives you? What keeps you moving when others would collapse?" Aisha straightened her posture, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "Sir, I don't fight to silence others. I fight because I know what it means to be underestimated. I know how it feels to be told you don't belong. Every step, every battle, is my way of proving that strength isn't about size or arrogance, it's about persistence." The commander studied her for a long moment, then gave a single nod. "Persistence may win battles. But discipline wins wars. See that you remember both." When she left the tent, her heart was steady, her mind focused. She understood that this was no fairy tale where triumph meant the end of struggle. Every victory only raised expectations higher. Yet instead of fear, she felt a fire within her, a determination to climb further, not for glory, but for the countless others who might one day walk the same path. In the barracks that night, as soldiers celebrated their success, Aisha sat quietly at the edge of her bunk. She allowed herself a small smile, reflecting on the long road she had traveled since the day they laughed at her for being small, for being weak. She had not only silenced the laughter but transformed it into respect. More importantly, she had proven something deeper, That resilience, discipline, and heart could reshape the battlefield just as much as strength and size. And though she knew many challenges lay ahead, she embraced them with unwavering resolve. For in every trial she saw not a burden but an opportunity to rise, to inspire, and to continue carving her place in a world that had once tried to deny her. Her journey was far from over. But for the first time she no longer walked it alone. She carried with her the respect of her comrades, the acknowledgement of her commanders, and the unshakable belief that she had earned her place not by chance, but by sheer, unrelenting will. The soldier they had mocked was gone. In her place stood a warrior who had forged herself through fire, sweat, and persistence. And in the silence of the night, as the camp settled into slumber, Aisha whispered a promise to herself. This is only the beginning. The sun dipped lower across the Pacific horizon, painting the waters in hues of gold and crimson. The airfield roared with the thunder of engines as the squadron prepared for what everyone knew would be the final great push. The corsairs stood like steel beasts, wings spread, their dark blue frames glinting in the fading light. Each pilot checked his gear, his mind heavy with both anticipation and dread. For weeks they had fought tooth and nail, carving through swarms of enemy fighters and crippling supply convoys. The Japanese defenses were fierce, relentless, but every day the corsair pilots had proven their worth. Now orders had come down. One last mission, one that would decide the fate of an island fortress blocking the Allies' path deeper into the Pacific. Jack, the young lieutenant who had once been mocked for flying a clumsy gull-winged beast, stood beside his corsair, running his hand along the metal fuselage as if it were a trusted companion. The mechanics bustled around, fueling the plane and tightening bolts, but Jack seemed lost in thought. He remembered the taunts from the early days, the laughter, the doubts. Yet now no one mocked him. Every pilot on the field had seen what the corsair could do. They had seen Jack cut through enemy aces with maneuvers once thought impossible. Respect had replaced ridicule. Ready for one last dance? His wingman Carter asked, striding over with his helmet under his arm. His grin was tired, worn by months of battle, but his eyes still carried the spark of defiance. Jack smirked. If this is the last dance, let's make sure the band never stops playing. Moments later, engines screamed to life. The airfield trembled as one after another, the corsairs surged forward, their propellers slicing the air. Dust clouds swirled, men shouted, and the island seemed to hold its breath as the squadron leapt skyward, climbing into the burning orange skies of dusk. The mission was simple on paper but hellishly dangerous in practice. The enemy fortress lay on a rocky island ringed with anti-aircraft guns, defended by the best pilots Japan still had left. Intelligence warned of kamikaze units waiting to sacrifice themselves in swarms. The corsairs' job was to clear the skies, escort bombers in, and then bring as many men home as possible. As they flew higher, Jack's radio crackled. All units, maintain formation. Enemy fighters expected in heavy numbers. The clouds ahead darkened, shadows shifting within them. Then, like hornets from a nest, the enemy appeared, dozens upon dozens of Zeros diving in perfect formation. The sky erupted instantly into chaos, tracers slicing through the clouds, engines roaring, men shouting over radios. Jack yanked his corsair into a climb, bullets raking the air where he had been only moments before. Carter was on his tail, firing bursts that shredded a Zero trying to sneak behind Jack. Flames engulfed the enemy plane, and it spiraled downward, trailing smoke. "Thanks, partner," Jack muttered. "Don't thank me yet. They're coming in waves." Carter shouted back. The battle raged, a swirling storm of steel and fire. The corsairs held their own, their superior speed and dive power allowing them to strike hard and then vanish, reappearing at impossible angles. Jack felt the G-forces crush against him as he dove through two enemy fighters, pulling a tight loop that put him squarely behind them. He fired, 2 bursts, 2 kills. But victory carried a cost. A corsair to his left exploded in midair, its pilot never able to eject. Another spun helplessly into the sea, smoke trailing from its engine. Each loss felt like a knife to the heart, yet there was no time to mourn. Survival depended on focus, and focus meant pushing grief aside. Bomber group approaching target, the radio crackled. "Escort them through," Jack barked. He led his squadron into a protective wall, guns blazing as the lumbering bombers closed in on the fortress below. Flak exploded around them, the sky turning into a nightmarish storm of black bursts and fiery shrapnel. One bomber took a direct hit and plunged, but the rest pressed on. "Hold steady. Just a little longer," Jack shouted. The fortress loomed below, its guns roaring. Then the bomb bays opened, and the island shook as payloads rained down. Explosions tore through hangars, fuel depots, and artillery positions. Smoke and fire erupted across the landscape, the enemy's stronghold collapsing under the fury. But the Japanese pilots weren't done. A final, desperate wave surged up from hidden airfields. They came screaming with reckless fury, many ignoring self-preservation. Kamikazes. Jack's blood ran cold. Intercept them. Don't let them reach the bombers. The Corsairs dove again, slamming into the wave with everything they had. Jack shot down one then another, but still they came, relentless, suicidal. One kamikaze struck a bomber, obliterating it in a ball of fire. Another veered toward Carter's plane. "Carter, break!" Jack yelled. But Carter's voice came calm and steady over the radio. "Can't shake him, Jack. No. Don't you dare." A split second later, Carter's guns blazed. He tore through the kamikaze's wing, but the explosion caught them both. Jack watched in horror as Carter's Corsair, trailing smoke, spiraled down toward the ocean. "Carter. Pull up. Bail out." Static. Then silence. Jack's chest clenched, but there was no time. More kamikazes swarmed the bombers and rage surged through him like fire. He pushed his Corsair harder than ever, pulling maneuvers that defied the limits of machine and man. He dove, climbed, rolled, becoming a blur of vengeance and precision. Each pull of the trigger was another desperate prayer. By the time the last bomber released its payload, the sky was littered with burning wreckage, friend and foe alike. The fortress below lay in ruins, its guns silenced, its runways shattered. The mission was complete. But the price had been high. The surviving Corsairs limped back toward base, silence filling the radios where once there had been voices of laughter and camaraderie. Jack's plane bore bullet holes, his fuel low, but he pushed on, his heart heavier than ever before. When they landed, cheers erupted from ground crews, but Jack could only climb down slowly, his body aching, his mind replaying Carter's last words. Around him, men hugged, cried, shouted in relief. Victory had been achieved, yet it felt hollow. That night, the squadron gathered for a somber toast. Glasses clinked in honor of the fallen, Carter, the others who never returned. The commander raised his glass. "They mocked this plane once. They mocked us. But tonight, the Corsair proved what it was always meant to be, the hammer of the Pacific. Let history never forget it." Jack looked at the empty chair where Carter should have been. He lifted his drink, voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "To Carter. To the Corsair. To victory bought with the blood of brothers." The room echoed with murmurs of agreement, though many eyes were wet. Outside, the wrecks still smoldered on the horizon, a grim reminder of what war demanded. As Jack stepped out into the night air, the stars shimmered overhead, countless and eternal. He looked skyward, imagining Carter flying among them, free of pain, free of war. The Corsair had earned its place in history. But for Jack, its legacy would always be tied not only to triumph, but to sacrifice. And as the winds whispered across the island, carrying the echoes of engines long gone, Jack knew one truth would remain forever. Legends are not born of machines alone, but of the men who dare to fly them. The end.